Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is August the 31st of 2015. The show is being pre-recorded on August 30th, 2015, and we've got a number of topics to get into tonight. We're going to focus again a little bit more on the Middle East, but of course we should mention that we come to you on an evening where economic collapse and general warfare across the globe is hanging in the background. And of course we saw last week with the stock market crash, the stock markets rose a bit throughout the evening and ended lower. They did that twice at least. There seems to be an uptick that's related to the events in Yemen, but we don't quite know what this means, whether or not this is the uptick again from the drop down in the economic stock exchanges, or whether or not this is simply a slight uptick in a gradual and increasing decline. And of course we can say categorically that any talk of an economic recovery is foolish in the United States. There is no economic recovery. There is no economic recession. It is a world economic depression. And at some point maybe we'll go back over the solutions for that depression as well. But tonight we've got a number of other topics to get into. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Yemen are all on the docket for tonight. So we can talk about how we are heading for collision in the Middle East yet again. And we'll get into that. Now, for those of you who are just joining us here for the first time, tonight I would like to encourage you to catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. UCY.TV is where you'll find it. And if you go to the show's personal webpage, UCY.TV/TT for Truth on the Tracks, you'll find an archive page. The archives of the show up there on the left, the YouTube videos down there on the bottom of the page, and the links to my more recent articles as they appear on BrandonTurbeville.com on that page. Now, if you're interested in my articles, then I'd encourage you to go to ActivistPost.com, NaturalBlaze.com, where where my articles come out regularly. And if you're interested in my work specifically, then go to BrandonTurbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archives of this show, all of the relevant information. All of the books are there. In the books tab, you'll see events that I might be speaking at. On occasion, I do those things. And any other relevant information to the general local area. If it's in the South Carolina, North Carolina area, it's on our radar. We generally try to put that up. And there's going to be some updates to the website as well that hopefully make the website a little bit better in terms of the information that's able to get out. Of course, all of these improvements are planned, but sometimes, life and events get in the way, and it doesn't take shape as fast as we'd like to see it take shape. But they will come, and this will be a gradual phase-in of the improvements of the website and of the show. So keep checking BrandonTurbeville.com. Last week I gave a cryptic announcement for some products, I guess we should say, or some information that will be coming out on BrandonTurbeville.com. Last week I gave that information out. I didn't say what it was, and I still can't say what it is, but I'm just saying stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have more information by next week. And that's what we're hoping to do. And so check back to the show next week, and also check BrandonTurbeville.com, and we will have more information about that. So we need to get into events. I have one more announcement, though. I would like to remind people that on September 12th, from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m., that's on a Saturday, in Charlotte, North Carolina, at the CPCC Elizabeth Building, and that is at 1231 Elizabeth Avenue, Charlotte, North Carolina. we are seeing a seminar called Healthy Kids Naturally, and this is going to have a number of speakers at this event, and it's going to have Dr. Philip Arnone, or Arnone, I don't know how you say that, pronounce that name, Naomi Zeskin, Danielle Papagiorgio, Dr. Greg Brannon, A.J. Lanigan, Crystal Cliff, Dr. Dave Hamilton, and the keynote speaker will be Dr. Andrew Wakefield. So he is going to be there giving the speech in Charlotte on September the 12th. If you would like to attend, you do have to buy tickets to attend, and they range anywhere from $49 to $59. You can purchase those tickets on that website. I think vaccineeducation.org might be one of the websites that you can find it, but I would just encourage you to email Lisa Jelani, who is the founding member of People Advocating Vaccine Education, PAVE. Email her at wearepave@yahoo.com. That's WERPAVE@yahoo.com, and she'll give you information on how to buy tickets and that sort of thing. So please go check that out if you're able to do so. Now, I think we should get into the issue of Lebanon, because this brings us to the general area where we focused on so much, the Syrian situation. This brings in the Iranians, this brings in the Iraqis, this brings in ISIS, and of course when you bring in ISIS, you essentially bring in all the European members of NATO, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, everybody that's in NATO. You bring in Turkey, obviously, NATO member as well, Jordan, Israel. So this is a regional conflagration now. We've had situations in the past, and we know that ISIS fighters have been coming in through Turkey, and they've also been crossing back and forth across the Lebanese border, coming across Turkey and many times into Lebanon and back through the Lebanese border into Syria. They've also been wreaking havoc on some of the Lebanese towns, and Hezbollah has been doing what it can to stop them. The Syrians have been doing what they can to stop them, and now the Syrians and Hezbollah are working together to stop ISIS from these border crossings. So they've taken control over almost every single one of the Lebanese-Syrian border crossings. And, of course, as we talked about in the previous show, the Kurds have largely sealed most of the border with Turkey in the northern part of Syria, except for that 68-mile wide area which they were about to launch an attack on before the Turks and the Americans announced an ISIL-free zone, conveniently in that 68-mile zone, to protect the terrorists. But now we see Lebanon is being dragged into the flames of color revolution and civil war. And this is what we've got to talk about. I've got an article, Color Revolution in Lebanon, designed to weaken Hezbollah, Syria, Iran. And that's up at activistpost.com, up at BrandonTurbeville.com. The folks at InfoWars were nice to repost that over on Infowars.com as well. So we appreciate that to get the word out. So take a look at the article if you're looking at more detail. But just to give you an idea of what's going on here, over the past week or so, there have been demonstrations in Lebanon over uncollected garbage that have descended into violent clashes between protesters and police. Now, masses of demonstrators have been swelling in the streets of Beirut in a movement they're calling the You Stink movement. Now, with these developments that are suddenly taking place in Lebanon, and with the Syrian crisis taking place next door, and taking that into context, and taking the Iranian nuclear deal into context as well, it's reasonable to question whether or not these protests are a legitimate expression of discontent with an inefficient government, or whether it's a product of a Western-backed color revolution apparatus that's aimed at destabilizing Lebanon, particularly Hezbollah, and further weakening the Shiite arc of influence. Now, obviously, I tend to lean on the side that this is a color revolution. I think all the evidence, all of the hallmarks of a color revolution are there. But just to take a look at this, analyze events in Lebanon, it's like the rest of the Middle East, right? Thanks to the British and the French and the imperialist mechanisms of control there, very little can be considered a simple answer to a simple question, right? It's all very conflated and convoluted. Lebanon has been racked with economic depression, much like most countries across the world. They've had extreme cultural tensions. They've had color revolutions. They've had civil war. They've had civil war brinkmanship. They've had terrorism. All of this they've had for decades. And it's been the target of outside forces for a number of years. Some of those forces working for a positive effect, some of them working for a negative effect. Or I guess positive and negative might not be the qualitative terms that we want to use. I think maybe saying that working for mutual or national gain through different perspectives, I guess we should say. But I think it's clear to say that the NATO realm is acting in the negative variety, because the NATO realm, the NATO sphere of influence, is interested in nothing but world hegemony, and in that sense there's nothing positive to be found there. Other countries are seeking to extend cooperation in Lebanon, but that, of course, is self-interest. But we hope for enlightened self-interest, enlightened mutual self-interest, and that's what we hope for. So, back to the topic at hand, we need to look at the background of these movements, or this movement in Lebanon, in order to understand how this is a color revolution. And the background of the issue is the trash pickup question. And it's the issue around which the protest began early on. It was an entirely legitimate issue. We have squabbling within the Lebanese government that resulted in gridlock on issues like the disposal of garbage and the economic crisis. In fact, the economic crisis has helped bring funding of garbage disposal into question itself, but these are the questions that Lebanon is facing. So when the government brought up the idea of the privatization of trash disposal services, and the Lebanese people erupted in anger, and because they understand, unlike Americans, who seem to be one of the few countries in the world who can't understand why this damn privatization movement is a bad idea, the Lebanese people erupted in anger because they understood that privatization means higher prices, poorer service, and even less accountability. So they went out and protested. And they're already suffering from the effects of a world economic depression. Lebanon's main source of national income is tourism and banking, and that's not a very stable economic base. But they've seen drastic reductions in tourism due to the fighting in Syria and the spillover of fighting across the border. That's understandable, and of course, even the banking sector seems to not be putting the economic function into Lebanon that it had. So an increase of Syrian refugees also, along with the Palestinian refugees already there. They're taxing the social fabric and the social safety net system in Lebanon. There's a good article by Andrew Koribko, and it's called "Lebanon's Future is on the Line," and it directly affects Syria, where he talks about a number of the background issues of the Lebanese situation. But we're going to try to do some more here. Lebanon's debt to GDP ratio is actually one of the world's highest. It's 143% debt to GDP. And the unemployment rate among young people in Lebanon stands officially at 34%. Now, we don't know if they determine their unemployment ratings based on the same methods that the United States does. In other words, if you're not looking for work, then you're not counted, essentially, or if you've given up, you're not counted, or if you've been unemployed for a certain amount of time, you're not counted. So we don't know if this is 68% or really the official 34%. So we'd have to do more digging, but regardless, 34 is astronomically high. The economic crisis has actually become so strained in Lebanon that Prime Minister Tamam Salam recently announced that the government might not be able to pay salaries to workers as early as next month. Lebanon also is in the middle of an acute political crisis. They've been without a president since May 2014. The previous president, his term ended and no president was appointed. Prime Minister Salam is now saying that he might resign if the political gridlock continues. The resignation itself is only going to add to the tensions there, because the prime minister appoints the president, and if the prime minister resigns, there's nobody to appoint the president, and that throws Lebanon into a constitutional crisis on top of the protests, on top of the terrorism, and on top of the economic hardship. Now, for those of you who don't know, the political makeup of the Lebanese government, it's very complex. Lebanon is made up of about 4.5 million people. It's got a very diverse demographic population. There's 18, I think they mentioned 18 different religious groups recognized in the country's constitution, right? That's not just Muslims, Sunnis, Shiites, Alawites, but there are also Druze, there's Maronite Catholics, there's a number of other different religions. So because of all of this, all of these religions and the small nature of Lebanon and the way it was broken up, we have something referred to as the National Pact, and it's sort of an unwritten understanding that the president is always going to be a Maronite, the prime minister will be a Sunni, the Speaker of the Parliament will be a Shiite, and there's a number of other stipulations, right? And there's very, very few historical exceptions. So this concept of governance is very unique, but it's also, there's another complementary application of this is called confessionalism. And that is a situation where you have Christians and Muslims sharing equal seats in a unicameral parliament. Each group's respective composition is determined proportionally by sect. So in other words, we divide it into the two religions, and of the two religions, the group's composition is made up of the different sects in that religion. So it was originally meant to be a temporary solution that was enacted back in the 1920s, and it was refined by the 1989 Taif Agreement that ended the Lebanese Civil War, and it's been in place today. It's still in place there today. So that gives you a sense of the confusion and crisis of Lebanese governing right now. So the political situation as it stands in Lebanon right now is suggesting that one of two men, and that's Michael Ayoun and Samir Jajia, I guess that's how we say his name, that these two guys have the potential to be president, but and both of them seem to represent the what we call it, the trans-religious political coalitions, right? Now, Ayoun is allied with Hezbollah, while Jajia is tied to former Prime Minister Said Hariri, who is a Lebanese Saudi billionaire. Hariri, a Lebanese Saudi billionaire. And remember, we had WikiLeaks cables coming back from the Saudi Foreign Ministry suggesting that Hariri still maintains connections and contacts with Saudi intelligence and the Saudi royal family. And in fact, the connections are deep enough that Hariri once thought it was a reasonable idea to ask the Saudis to fund his political party. So the connections there are pretty strong. So now, into the question of whether or not this is a color revolution, we got to look. The protests that originally took place in Lebanon were surrounding a legitimate issue. Yes, absolutely. Lack of effective implementation of a trash pickup plan and the potential for privatization. All things that deserve protest, all things that deserve resistance. These protests, though, have turned violent, and the original issue is now taking a back seat to the issue of privatization or more efficient trash pickup. Now the issue is government corruption. That is the hallmark of a color revolution. In other words, a legitimate issue subsumed by shadowy ideals like government corruption. There's no concrete demands to back this up. You're against government corruption? Yeah, everybody's against government corruption. You're against world hunger? We are all against world hunger. The question is, what are the specifics of what you're upset about? What are the specifics of what you're going to do about it? And the lack of those last two things, the specifics, the lack of demands, the lack of tangible issues even, that is the hallmark of a color revolution. Right? Government corruption is generally the go-to ideal since everybody hates it. Everybody hates government corruption. So, and the likelihood of stopping it is so low because you're going to get into the issue of human nature. But we in color revolutions, all we need is pressure provided by the people power masses out in the streets. And the idea is once the standing government is brought down, the perceived change in the power structure tends to alleviate that social protest just simply by it happening. Now, again, the lack of concrete demands is the hallmark of a color revolution. The goal of the color revolution is regime change. It's social tension. It's distraction. It's not real progress. A lack of demands precludes the ability of the masses to actually bring about positive, tangible change. It does, however, allow for a steam valve for public anger, and that's part of the reason that it's used. When you have times where a color revolution's goal is regime change, the results are generally, it's unfortunate that the individuals who have backed the color revolution end up seeing that the person that they actually want to assume power do just that. So that's what happens. It's important to point out that the marketing capabilities behind these protests in Beirut too, there's a seeming coalition of individual citizens and opposing organizations that are all assembled, and we're told they're all assembled organically, under one name for the purposes of achieving these goals, which they haven't even stated yet. It's called the You Stink movement. So I guess it joins the ranks of a number of other movements who were branded with catchy names to popularize itself as a political force, just as the Americans saw Occupy movement, the Ukrainians saw the Euromaidan, the Pora movement, the Orange Revolution. In Serbia, it was Otpor. In Lebanon, before it was the Cedar Revolution. So all of these things are slogans and symbols that are the product of mass marketers that are employed by state departments and intelligence agencies for the sole purpose of destabilizing or overthrowing a democratically elected or not so democratically elected government, which is seen as unfavorable to the world oligarchy. So bear that in mind the next time you start sharing Facebook memes from groups that have just popped up all of a sudden regarding scary African warlords who cut people's feet off and apparently have been dead for 10 years, a la Coney 2012. Forgot about him pretty quick, didn't we? So that shows you how a color revolution can start. That wasn't a color revolution. That was a mass distraction of abject stupidity. But we had the Occupy movement, and you can see how that took off, right? Legitimate issues, of course, were subsumed with absolute nothingness. It was a vacuum of nothingness. We don't want demands. We don't want to be specific about what we're complaining about. We don't want demands because we might win our demands, and at that point you become co-opted because you want a demand. It was absolute stupidity. But this is how it continued, and what you saw was a mass of hordes of unemployed, hopeless young people getting their heads stoved in by police and smoking pot in the park, and nothing, absolutely nothing, came of the Occupy movement. The only thing the Occupy movement could say was that we changed the conversation. Yeah, everybody changes the conversation. Britney Spears changes the conversation whenever she shaves her head or puts out a new album. Lady Gaga changes the conversation. So what? You change the conversation. The conversation is always changing. And that's what we should be aware of. That's why you need demands, and that's why I constantly remind people that you need demands. And if you don't know what those demands are, well, we can help, because you should go back to the archives of this show or even pick up my book, 5 Cent Solutions, or go look at some of my articles, 1% Wall Street sales tax, nationalize the Federal Reserve, that sort of thing. We can get mass traction demands. All right, back to Lebanon. The You Stink movement, that's what we've got to talk about. It's also known as a youth movement. So, granted, most social protest movements do tend to be driven by younger people, but it's also true that movements that represent populist sentiment tend to be more diverse in terms of age and support. Not even necessarily the people out on the ground, but in terms of support. But it generally does bring middle-aged people out with them, people from all walks of life, if you're talking about populism. That question aside, color revolutions generally rely on swarming adolescents, hordes of youth, again, unemployed young people, right? They use the energy, the anger, the pent-up aggression of young people who are out of work, who are devoid of hope, which provokes violent actions between police and protesters. And if they can't get them to fight on their own, then they'll send in provocateurs to provoke the police, and the police will start cracking heads. So this is precisely the population from which the overwhelming majority of the USTIC movement is drawn, right? The young people, unemployed. Remember, I just mentioned the high rate of unemployment among young people in Lebanon. So this is where the ranks of much of this protest movement are being drawn. Now, the desires of infiltrators to cause the protest movement to move in a more violent direction, as I said, the provocateurs. We have not yet positively identified any of the provocateurs in the Lebanese movement, but we know they're there, right? We consider the sizable network of Western NGOs and U.S. aid agencies working inside Lebanon. It's reasonable to wonder whether or not these groups are the destabilizing and infiltrating forces behind the violence that's taking place in Lebanon right now. But we know that there are infiltrators, right? We've got an article by Foreign Policy, the news wing of the Council on Foreign Relations. And this is what the article says. The real challenge to the protest movement comes not from the government, but in organizing a common front that stretches across Lebanon's religious and class divides. It's already a struggle. Organizers blame the clashes on infiltrators intent on disrupting the peaceful nature of the demonstration. USTINC's Facebook page posted a video of hundreds of young men entering protest en masse and referred to them as hooligans who purposefully incited violence against the security forces. They really wanted to damage the demonstration, Debian said of the protesters who clashed with police. They want to move the demonstration into a sectarian conflict, which we totally refuse. All right, end quote. So given the fact that the agitators are suspected of not only causing violence, but also attempting to cause sectarian conflict, it's reasonable to wonder whether or not the intent for Lebanon is more than just a color revolution, but maybe the descent into chaos and civil war that we're seeing in Syria. So it's also important to point out that the You Stink movement is calling for the resignation of Prime Minister Salam. That's a demand, I guess. That's a demand that's going to put the country into the middle of a constitutional crisis. So, do you want efficiency? Well, you can't call for the resignation of the prime minister necessarily. It's just going to make things worse. So, why would foreign elements want to see a color revolution in Lebanon? I think a lot of people might be confused with the suggestions that the West would like to see the government of Lebanon, and keep in mind the government of Lebanon is separate from Hezbollah, right? So I think a lot of people might be confused to see that the West may want the government of Lebanon be destroyed or destabilized, particularly when that government was placed in power by a Western-backed color revolution to begin with. So there's a number of ways in which the collapse of the Lebanese government and the governing structure in Lebanon would not only benefit the West, but also hurt Assad in Syria. So I just went through the demographic and governing structure of Lebanon earlier to explain how complex this whole situation is. When you see how complex it is, you can see how fragile the Lebanese governing system is, right? And how it might fall into chaos if just the right amount of pressure is applied to it. But again, the question's why. First, if you cause chaos in Lebanon, and if the chaos is great enough, then that's going to force Hezbollah to remove its forces that are fighting ISIS in Syria, and they're going to have to bring them back to deal with the social disorder at home. And the removal of forces from Syria is going to greatly relieve pressure on terrorist forces and deprive Assad of a very important ally. The Syrian army would then find it a greater challenge to defend the Lebanese-Syrian border, and it would possibly even create a situation where the ISIS fighters and quote-unquote moderate rebels, moderate cannibals forces would be able to push deeper into Lebanon. So if Hezbollah forces are withdrawn from Syria, we also have this question of the Beirut-Damascus highway, which is likely to become a target of Western-backed terrorist forces. If so, it would make one and eventually both of the lifelines to the Syrian capital significant targets. We would see attempts by terrorist forces to cut these highway routes. Already we have the Latakia-Damascus highway, which is the second lifeline to the capital, already in danger from attacks coming from ISIS fighters. So if you cut the Hezbollah fighters and bring them back into Lebanon, you're likely going to see the opening up a greater weakness surrounding this Beirut-Damascus highway, and see that come under fire as well. Now, aside from Syria, we would also see chaos in Lebanon as helping to weaken the political order, not just of Lebanon and Hezbollah in the short run, but in the long run as well, right? If Hezbollah is forced to concern itself with only with the political solution in Lebanon, its own influence and its own ability to assist in fighting terrorism in Syria, as well as on its own borders, is going to be diminished. And that's all of this is leading to a net reduction in the fighting capability of the anti-ISIS coalition. The real one, not the U.S. one, but the real anti-ISIS coalition. Syria, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, or Hezbollah. These are the anti-ISIS forces. The result of drawing Hezbollah away from Syria back into Lebanon is effectively going to isolate Hezbollah and the Syrian army from each other, and that's going to weaken the resistance to terrorism. It's also going to weaken the resistance to the Western forces. And what it's going to do is separate the Shiite arc of influence from the central and eastern ends from Syria and Iran, right? In other words, Iran would be cut off from Hezbollah. Hezbollah would essentially be more isolated. You'd see the lack, maybe not cut off. Cut off is not exactly the right word, but it would essentially eliminate this arc of influence, right? It would isolate forces confined to their own domestic concerns, and it would reduce the amount of cooperation on an overarching type of agenda or goal. And that's what they want. Remember, back in 2006, there was an article reported by Seymour Hersh called The Redirection, and we've talked about it a number of times here on this show, but I need to repeat it. Seymour Hersh wrote in 2006, quote, "To undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shiite, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shiite organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda," end quote. So, it remains to be seen how far the color revolution is going to go in Lebanon. The attempts to destabilize Iran in 2009 failed, but the previous attempt in Lebanon in 2005 was successful. So only time is going to tell whether or not the West is going to succeed in bringing Lebanon into a state of chaos that resembles the chaos in Syria. And for the sake of the Lebanese people and the people of the Middle East, and indeed the people of the world, we hope that rational actors are going to appear and put an end to this chaos taking place across the country, which we believe to be Western-backed until proven otherwise. If not, then we're going to see two of the three pieces that that would have been placed in the Middle East already placed. Right? We have the Syrians dealt with, the Lebanese dealt with, and then the last domino to fall would be Iran, and that's the last domino to fall before the final confrontation with Russia and China. But I just want to address one more time that article by Seymour Hersh, The Redirection. He says, to undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shiite, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with the Saudi Arabian's government, which we know has happened. That's openly admitted now, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shiite organization that is backed by Iran. Well, all that's admitted. ISIS fighters have attacked Hezbollah in Lebanon in the past, but even aside from that, look at the color revolution issue happening now, and Hezbollah has been a target of the West for some time. It also says the U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. That has been borne out to be true. He says a byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. What's that? It's ISIS. So, very good article, and I would recommend that people go read The Redirection by Seymour Hersh to get a vision of the future from 2006. Now, we got to turn to another topic. If you were watching the mainstream media, you would have no idea that a war was launched a couple of weeks ago. In fact, you would have heard nothing about it. You wouldn't have known that this was a direct military assault and a direct military invasion of Yemen by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We have in early August the invasion, Saudi Arabians, of course, and members of a coalition to attack the Houthi rebels in Yemen have been doing that for some months. The bombing of Yemen has been taking place for some months. But in early August, we have the direct military invasion of Yemen by the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates. And this is, you can see video of the invasions. And again, a war has taken place and the mainstream media has remained silent on it, except for a few scant mentions here and there of just brief mentions of the UAE Saudi invasion of Yemen. So, again, months ago we've seen the bombing raids by the Saudis, and that's been devastating to the civilian population, but it's done little to dislodge the Houthi rebels and their hold on territory, aside from one area, the port of Aden, which they had never fully seized anyway. That was sort of a stronghold of the forces that are loyal to former Yemeni President Hadi and the Al-Qaeda fighters that support that side of the affair. During the course of the bombing, the Houthis have pretty much demonstrated that not only are they able to withstand the Saudi bombing campaign, but they were able to launch retaliatory strikes inside Saudi Arabia. So remember, the Saudis started bombing the Houthis after the Houthis had marched all the way across the country and were about to seize the last few bastions of Yemeni official government resistance. The Hadi forces, as well as the Al-Qaeda forces that are fighting alongside of them and filling up the vacuums. There was this last area that was belonging to the government. There was also one last area, there's areas out in the east of Yemen that were controlled by Al-Qaeda forces, but the Houthis have largely taken control of every other part of the country. Largely speaking, the Saudis initiated a bombing campaign, killed scores of innocent civilians, destroyed lots of civilian infrastructure, but didn't do much to help the other forces. Didn't do much to hurt the Houthis. It killed several, a lot of them, but it didn't stop them from, holding their territory. It did, however, back them out of a lot of the gains they made in Aden, and Aden is the port city there in Yemen. So the Houthis launched a military strike, counterattack, which saw Houthi fighters attacking Saudi military bases inside Saudi Arabia. And this is a big deal because they were not able, as far as I understand, to take over control of the military bases. So this was not a successful campaign in that sense. But what it did show was that a ragtag group of fighters came into Saudi Arabia and attacked a military base, put it under fire, and that reveals the paper tiger that is the Saudi Arabians, or that all are the Saudi Arabians. So that was revealed. The Saudi ambition of bombing the Houthis into submission changed in early August when the Saudis apparently saw that the bombing wasn't going to do it alone, and they got their coalition colleague, the United Arab Emirates, to begin a ground invasion of Yemen. So again, largely unannounced by the media. We've had pictures circulating on Twitter. We've had, and these are not the same type of pictures that were circulating from the State Department and during the Ukrainian question, when they were simply fake. These are real pictures. We also have video of the tanks moving in. But we apparently have troops and columns of tanks that have landed in the port of Aden. We had videos taken of the tanks. There's apparently French-made Leclerc tanks that belong to the UAE, and they show the forces moving from Aden north, deeper into Yemen. And the reports are suggesting that about as many as 100 tanks, a third of the UAE's total armed forces, or armored forces, rather, are now engaged in Yemen. Alongside the tanks, we have a rumored armor brigade consisting of 1,000 to 3,000 UAE troops moving north toward the capital of Yemen. So there's a number of potentials here, potentials for Saudi success and Saudi failure. So these successes or failures are going to have reverberations across the Middle East, across North Africa, and eventually across the rest of the world. If the Saudis and the UAE succeed, the Houthi rebellion is going, would be defeated, and the fear of a Yemen that's allied with and receiving assistance from Iran is going to be temporarily but allayed nonetheless. Saudi Arabia would have demonstrated its military strength, despite the fact that it had to get the UAE to come in and bear the brunt of the operation. The GCC will be able to demonstrate its importance in the region, and Iran will be perceived as weakened on the Arabian Peninsula and in terms of its influence. Now, the risks to Saudi Arabia, if they fail, are actually, in my opinion, greater than the rewards they would reap if they succeeded. If the Saudis fail, they're going to have revealed themselves as the paper tiger that they are in terms of military power. They've already somewhat done that. If the Houthis are able to overcome the onslaught of the Saudi UAE forces, the fear that's instilled into other countries by the Western-backed Saudi military are going to evaporate. And so will the Saudi influence in the region if the coalition can't prevent this ragtag group of revolutionaries from achieving victory despite their own invasion of the country. So the Saudis are going to be forced to use the only method of diplomacy, if they fail in this mission. They're going to use the only method of diplomacy in international relations that's actually worked for them in the past, and that's the Saudi money. After all, the military option is going to be revealed as an empty threat. The financial option has worked splendidly for quite some time, but you're going to see them relying on deep pockets, but those pockets are getting more and more shallow because of the falling price of oil. This is a dangerous game they're playing. So it's also worth noting that if the Saudi military is going to reveal itself as weak and impotent in the future, it's quite possible that the Saudis will open themselves up to a domestic insurgency and social unrest as well. Remember when we talked about the Russians back before the communist revolution took hold in the early 1900s, 1917, we saw the loss, the Russian military losing the wars overseas and even on its own borders. And it was partially the military loss that helped really sow in that seed of lack of faith in the Tsarist Russia. That was one of the issues that played a role in allowing this, allowing the communist revolution to really take hold and gain enough, not enough support necessarily, but gain enough apathy, I guess, to prevent the average person from fighting the communists on the side of the Tsar. So it was precisely the failure of a military adventure that helped see the communist revolution take place in Russia. So it's the failure of missions overseas and failure of military adventures that often help tip the scale, or if they don't tip the scale, they at least put more weight on it for something else to tip the scale. We've seen this in a number of different countries, and Saudi Arabia would be no different. I would imagine if they reveal themselves as a paper tiger, then you're going to have domestic insurgencies that either see the Saudi family as not Wahhabist enough and seek to overthrow it to impose a real totalitarian religious theocracy, or you'll see more liberal forces in Saudi Arabia who maybe aren't fans of living like apes, forcing women to wear stupid veils and beheading people for sorcery, or the gall to use their brain and abandon the religion that's been forced down their throats. So we could see a number of different things that take place there in Saudi Arabia as a result of a Saudi Arabian loss. Now, if the Houthis are able to inflict enough serious blows to the UAE and Saudi military hardware, the tanks, the armored vehicles, etc., the effectiveness of an already weak military will cause the Saudi and the UAE forces to weaken that much more. It can't be any other way, right? If you got 900 tanks and 300 of them get destroyed, well, you're weaker. Now, I think Tony Cartolucci has pointed out in one of his own articles that this could be one of the reasons the Western mainstream press has ignored the reports at this point. And in fact, he could be right, because there's some evidence that a rout of the Saudi and UAE forces are already taking place. If reports coming from news agencies like Al-Manar are accurate, the UAE is experiencing quite a massacre of its forces inside Yemen. On August 17th of this year, a report entitled "Yemen Turning into Holocaust of UAE Tanks Soldiers," Al-Manar quoted a source from inside the Houthi forces saying that, quote, "The sources also revealed that losses of the Emirati forces during the last 72 hours were more than 32 armored vehicles, 14 tanks, and 23 military vehicles, in addition to 38 soldiers and 8 officers killed," end quote. So, in 3 days, 32 armored vehicles, 14 tanks, 23 military vehicles, 38 soldiers, and 8 officers. That's pretty impressive from the point of view of the Houthis. Now, Al-Manar says that the UAE claimed only half of the casualties, right? So if the UAE admits to half of the casualties, we're talking about what? 15 armored vehicles, 7 tanks, 12 military vehicles, 14 or no, more than that, soldiers, 4 officers. That's still quite a sizable loss to any military force in a place like Yemen, where you're fighting ragtag forces, right? So it's undoubted that the West is well aware of the risks of the Saudi and UAE invasion of Yemen. The attempt to break the Houthis, the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Lebanese before the Iran nuclear deal can be finalized in the United States Congress allows new flows of Iranian money, support against the hordes of terrorists funded by the West for the purposes of overthrowing independent government. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that this could be a rush to get this done, to go ahead and break the Iraqis fully, break the Syrians, break the Lebanese before the Iranian nuclear deal is supported. and in Congress, and it looks like the idiots on Capitol Hill, bought and paid for by AIPAC and other Israeli interests, and neocons, fascists, just psychopathic lunatics wanting to see more warfare with the Iranians. So we're going to see that, likely see an Obama veto. Maybe we'll talk about that, but we need to get the Saudi question out of the way, and then we'll come back to the Iranian nuclear deal if we have time. What we see in Yemen, we know that Saudi Arabia has long openly supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq and Libya and other countries across the world. United Arab Emirates, of course, has done its own share of supporting terrorism. In Yemen, Saudi Arabia has supported Al-Qaeda terrorists fighting the Houthis. That is open. That is not really debatable. With the recent invasion, its support of terrorism has gone from funding and training and weapons to a direct military action in support of Al-Qaeda fighters on the ground. In areas where the Saudis and the UAE troops, as well as their pro-government allies, have passed through on their march north, it has been Al-Qaeda fighters who have filled that vacuum and assumed control of the areas that they've passed through. If you look at Aden, we see Al-Qaeda forces controlling a number of areas of the city. They're patrolling, they're creating a quasi-governmental structure in these areas. This is what Ahmed Al-Hajj writes for the Associated Press. He says, quote, "In Aden, Al-Qaeda militants and other Islamic extremists continue to patrol the streets. Hundreds of Al-Qaeda militants hold some key areas in the port city, exploiting a vacuum left by pro-government forces pushing north. A high-ranking pro-Hadi security official and two other high-ranking pro-Hadi police officers, all in Aden, said. We have a shortage of men, the state security official said. Getting equipment from coalition countries is easy. Getting men to operate them is hard," end quote. In other words, we've got the Saudis and the UAE forces acting as the spearhead for Al-Qaeda forces who march right in, unopposed, to go in and impose Sharia law and a number of other horrific laws that are imposed by savages on civilian and civilized populations. So, Saudi forces and the UAE forces march into a town, to a location. They run the Houthis out if they're able. Then they move on to another target. And behind them move in the Al-Qaeda forces to impose savagery and pre-civilization onto the unfortunate subjects down below. Now, it's important to point out yet again the corporate press and NATO countries whining and complaining over phantoms of Russian aggression, of the illegal annexation of Crimea, put illegal in scare quotes, the quote invasion of Ukraine. Not a single word of condemnation has been uttered regarding the open and flagrant launch of a direct war and invasion against Yemen by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. On one hand, you've got hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers flooding into Yemen, and nothing is said by the international community, meaning NATO, the real effective international communities, NATO. On the other hand, you've got no evidence of Russian aggression in Ukraine. The world is faced with the possibility of thermonuclear World War III, right? World War III over something that didn't happen, but not a word over a direct war launched in Yemen. In Yemen, we consider it an offense that's worthy of a coalition invasion from the Arab League if the Houthis overthrow a president that was essentially placed in his position by a foreign power to begin with, after that foreign power had coordinated the revolt that sent his predecessor packing. It's considered a violation of law if the Houthis oust this leader and replace him with somebody else. So, color revolution, destabilization is fine if done by the West. A domestic insurgency is a violation of international law, and we need an invasion if it's done by someone on the ground inside the country who actually belongs there. In Syria, we see the same thing, right? There's no barbaric atrocity or crime against humanity that's not justified in order to facilitate the destruction of the government of Assad. While Yemenis are condemned for overthrowing their corrupt and oppressive government, the legitimate, secular, and reforming leadership of Bashar al-Assad is considered illegitimate and that he's worthy of being deposed. The so-called rebels in Syria are considered the epitome of democracy, but the rebels in Yemen are considered a threat to international order. So it's the same thing in Ukraine. The U.S. instigated a color revolution that saw the ousting of a democratically, relatively speaking, elected president. In Ukraine, not like Yemen, the individuals on the ground who overthrew that government engaged in a campaign of attempted extermination of selected members of their countrymen, and they were hailed as heroes and people worthy of support, even to the point of pushing the possibility of nuclear war with Russia by the United States. So it's clear that some rebels are more equal than others. The concept of international law and democracy and human rights and self-determination are just one-way streets. The representation of Iran's involvement in the rebellion by the Western mainstream press is equally hypocritical, right? Remember, in both Ukraine and Syria, the United States has been not only the initiator of the destabilization, but an open supporter of the destabilization. In Yemen, Iran is being painted as an international terrorist and destabilization artist, even though there's very little evidence to point that Iran is behind the Yemeni rebellion. Its role has been painted as a meddler. So we have to remember the U.S., NATO, the GCC, they're painted as friends of democracy and human rights, but they don't give a damn about democracy or human rights. They have not, and they do not. So, in conclusion here, the invasion of Yemen by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates is both illegal and immoral, and it's an act against a country, both illegal and immoral, which, like any other nation, has the right to self-determination. The Saudis and the GCC are involved in Yemen purely for geopolitical purposes. That's clear, and you can prove that because they're not interested in human rights. The Saudis aren't interested in human rights. The UAE is not interested in human rights, certainly not at home, so certainly not anywhere else. If they succeed, they're going to deal a geostrategic blow to Iran. If they fail, they're going to be outing themselves as a paper tiger and opening up the possibility for domestic insurgency and revolution at home, as well as regional insubordination to their dictates that have been paid more attention to in the past, but maybe not so much in the future. They'll have to be relying solely on money, and that money is shrinking with the price of oil. So if the Saudis and the UAE fail in Yemen, it may portend the collapse of the U.S. NATO campaign in Syria and Iraq, since a key ally in the funding, training, and production of terrorists to be used in Syria and Iraq finds itself collapsing. But we don't know how real of a possibility that's going to be, how likely that would be in those terms, but undoubtedly the United States and NATO are well aware of it, and they are racing against the clock to make sure that that doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't happen before they achieve their goals. Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time. Catch us next week, 9 p.m. UCY.TV on Monday night. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.